Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here to be part of our forum on public education at a crossroads. When we discussed this, when I was planning it with John Patterson, he said, why don't we have something like a fireside chat? And I'm not sure we're going to come close to that, but it is an open discussion with some really wonderful experts who've been dedicated to this issue for a really long time. So public education is a significant issue for the League of Women Voters. A very basic principle of the League is that every person deserves access to a high quality public education. Education is not a consumer item to satisfy individual preferences. Funding public education is a legitimate use of public funds because public schools serve the common good. They unite our diverse communities and prepare citizens capable of self-governance. They are accountable to the public. They are open to all, and all are guaranteed access, which means they are everywhere. We all benefit from an education citizenry. Funding is critical to providing quality education. Since 1935, the League has supported the state's foundation funding program and has been a proponent of the state funding system that provides for adequate education resources in every community, regardless of the local capacity to adequately fund their schools. League of Women Voters Ohio supported the famous DeRolf lawsuit that challenged the constitutionality of the state's school funding system. We also support the vouchers lawsuit that challenges the use of public funds to pay for private education vouchers. Since the Fair School Funding Plan was first introduced, I think in 2019, we have supported its adoption. As you all know, the legislature is in the thick of the process of developing the next 2-year state budget that takes effect on July 1st. Public education has always been the largest part of the state budget, but it hasn't always satisfied the obligation to adequately and equitably fund public schools. What will our lawmakers do at this critical moment when public education, privatization, and tax cuts are all vying for public resources? Public education is at a crossroads. After more than 25 years of defying the courts, the legislature has a good remedy, but will they support it? Anything can happen. So our goal for tonight is to build a solid understanding of the need and what a meaningful remedy looks like. Understand the progress to date and where we go from here, and what each of us can do to help achieve fair school funding in the state. So we have a wonderful lineup of experts and leaders who know this subject better than anyone and know well the need for patient, long-term, sustained advocacy. So let me introduce them. First, we have Dr. Tanisha Pruitt, who's been a state policy fellow for Policy Matters Ohio for the last 2 years. Her research areas are education policy and criminal justice reform. She has a doctorate in public policy and urban affairs, and currently she is involved in the fair school funding fight as a member of All In for Ohio's Kids. I'm really so happy to see Tanisha here and her involvement in this issue. We need a new generation of advocates for public schools, and she's part of that new energy that we need to keep going forward. Our second presenter is Dr. Howard Fleeter, who is an economist who specializes in economics of education and school finance. He knows a lot about tax policy. He has taught public policy and he has helped to shape it. His consulting firm specializes in public finance and education. One of his clients is the Ohio Education Policy Institute, whose purpose is to provide nonpartisan data and analysis on education and tax policy. When Howard Fleeter says the Fair School Funding Plan achieves a constitutional remedy, people listen. And when he gave the green light to this, a lot of advocates were able to jump in and start feeling confident that we are fighting for the right thing. Third, we have former State Rep John Patterson, who is the namesake of the Patterson Plan, also known as Fair School Funding. He had the insight to convene education experts to shape a remedy to our vexing school funding problem, and to work in a bipartisan way with former Speaker Bob Cupp to recapture education as a nonpartisan responsibility of state government. His commitment to public education and fairness, his firsthand understanding of this issue as a high school social studies teacher in Ashtabula County, and his doctorate in education make him a great champion for fair school funding and for public schools. After serving in the legislature for 8 years and a partial victory for his signature legislation, he now directs the Ohio branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He, however, has not gone away. Our final presenter is Jim Batts, another former member of the Ohio House and a one-time Republican candidate for senator. Jim has been spearheading the continued efforts of the working group, that's the group of experts that created the plan in the first place, to improve on the plan and to make it the law. A former Northeast Ohio, a lawyer from Northeast Ohio, Jim is no stranger to making policy in Ohio. For years, he was a lobbyist and director of the Alliance for Adequate School Funding, a coalition of about 60 high-wealth, high-performing schools districts. So thank you all for being here and for all the work you've done to advance the cause of high-quality public education in Ohio. So to get started, school funding is a critical piece of the state budget, and the budget is the place to focus advocacy if we want a good outcome for public education. So, Tanisha, in your testimony before the Senate Education Committee a few weeks ago, you noted that how we fund schools is key to how able they are to educate all of our students. Schools are expected to do more, but funding has not kept up. So please give us a picture of recent state funding of public education. How much money goes to schools? How well are lawmakers meeting their obligation? And what other priorities are getting in the way?
Yes, thank you, Susie, and hi, everyone. So currently, what we found at Policy Matters is that Ohio is ranked towards the bottom, right? We're 46 in the nation when it comes to equitable distribution of funding. So that's, how we're spending funds in our schools, the distribution among districts, all of those different things. And it was actually conducted by Ed Week. They put together this, sort of data, this survey. And so what we see is that, Ohio is below the national average. And also we fall behind, the top states like Oklahoma and Illinois. So, as we're going into talking, a lot of my advocacy around fair school funding and school funding is to, continue to highlight this, right, to all of our lawmakers to say, like, when we're looking at, we may be thinking we're doing all of the right things, but when you look at where we fall compared to other states, compared to where we are in the country, we are falling significantly behind. And so what you see is that when you look at state aid, state foundation funding aid, which is, where a lot of the funds for the Fair School Funding Plan lie, you see that when it is, when you adjust for inflation, it is actually decreasing over time. And so what I'm sorry, those words were for a different slide, so ignore those, almost doubled. But when you just look at the, from like 2007, right? So we're looking at just before the recession going into where we are today, it may look like our funding levels, we're allocating, more, we're allocating higher levels, but when you adjust for inflation, we're actually not. And so what we're saying, with Policy Matters is that we need to make sure that the money that we are allocating towards foundation funding towards the Fair School Funding Plan needs to keep up with inflation so that we can make sure we are fully funding our public education. Next slide, please. So then, what sort of is getting in our way, right? Where we have these historic ed choice voucher expansions that we are seeing coming through, through different legislation coming. We've seen it in the recent House sub bill is that, spending for vouchers has increased drastically over the years. We looked at specifically since 2014. But when you look at just, the last 2 years alone, right, the funding has almost doubled. We've gone from about 200 million in fiscal year 2020 to close to 315 million in fiscal year 2022. And under the new House sub bill, that is expected to grow another 49 million each fiscal year in the next state budget, given that the Senate follows suit, with their bill and whatever ultimately gets passed in the final budget. And so what you see also is that scholarship costs increase. We'll also see substantial scholarship increases. In the House sub bill, was about 783 million proposed allocations for fiscal year 24 and 852 million in fiscal year 25. So these are both, both years close to $1 billion increases in funding going towards vouchers. And so we see this, right, like as one of the threats. Howard and everybody will get into the other things that may prevent us from fully funding schools in the future. But, what we're looking at now is this voucher expansion, the threat of privatization, the, word around the State House, the word around everywhere is that we're moving towards this universal voucher system. And so we must, kind of fight against these things, protect public schools, protect against harmful legislation that could result in up to $1 billion loss in revenue to public schools. There's, tax proposals like the flat tax that could result in about $543 million loss to public schools. And so we just must continue to advocate that, our priorities are in check and we are funding what is necessary, right, to kind of move Ohio up in those ranks, get us closer up to Oklahoma in terms of how we equitably distribute funding.
Thank you. So this is not a fake issue. We've got a real problem on our hands and we have a lot of work to do. I want to mention to people that if they have questions, they can put them in the chat and we'll be having a Q&A at the end. So be sure to add your ideas as we go. So the DeRolf decision found that the system is to be unconstitutional, and it's clear lawmakers have not adequately tackled the problem or made it a priority to fix the system. So next, I'd like to ask Howard Fleeter. 2 years ago, you testified that the Pair School Funding Plan provides a constitutional funding solution. Can you give us a quick primer on what the court said was the problem and what a constitutional funding system looks like? What makes solving this puzzle so challenging, and some understanding of what really is involved in the plan?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Susie. Hi, everyone. Thank you to everybody who's on the Zoom. It's a beautiful Thursday night in Columbus, so anybody who's choosing to allocate their time to listen to people talk about school funding, I salute you. So appreciate your attention to this matter. So before I answer Susie's question, I just want to tag on to what Tanisha said. I've seen the not yet final data on vouchers for this year, 2023, and we're over $600 million. And the year's not over yet, so that figure is probably going to grow. So yeah, to say that vouchers have exploded in this state is not an exaggeration by any way, shape, or form. So to get to the question that Susie asked me, what does the Constitution say about education, and what is it that we, what are our goals for constructing an education funding system that will do the things that Susie outlined in her preamble and that Tanisha alluded to in her remarks? So Ohio funds at K-12 education pretty much the same way every other state does. It's a combination of state and local property taxes and state aid. We also have about 200 districts that have school district income taxes. Those are a relatively small percentage of revenue, about 4%, but they're important in the places that do utilize those. But every state does this basically the same way. You have local property taxes and you have state aid, and it's a partnership between the two. And the local property taxes allow some level of local control. You can get your voters to support issues. You can pursue priorities that are important for you, your community. But the state aid is essential to do two things. One is to make sure that the level of funding is adequate, and two, to make sure that the level of funding is equitable. And, I got started in this in the early 1990s, a couple years after I finished grad school and got a job as a public policy professor at Ohio State. Governor Voinovich had just been elected governor. He was looking to come find somebody to do a study of Ohio school finance that, I think his hope was to make the DeRolf suit go away. It didn't go away, so I guess I failed in that regard, but I was the consultant who did the report. And, the title of my report was Equity, Adequacy, and Reliability in Ohio School Finance, and it was released in November of 1992. And if I were to write a report right now, I would call it Equity, Adequacy, and Reliability in Ohio Education Finance. The issues are the same now as they were over 30 years ago, which is, I guess, both good and bad, right? And I think that we understand what it is that we need to do, right? And, the reason, the DeRolf decision was a legal challenge, right, brought by over 500 school districts that questioned that, whether the system that we have of state and local funding complied with the thorough and efficient clause of the Ohio Constitution. And it's really important to understand that, K-12 education is different than other public services. And it's different because it is specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And, one of the issues, in terms of adequacy is making sure that the funding levels are sufficient to meet the needs of different kinds of students. And typically the way we do this, and the way a lot of states do this, is that their legislature meets and they deliberate and they hear testimony and they make decisions and they come up with dollar amounts. And that's what we were doing in Ohio back in the 1990s. And the DeRolf ruling very clearly, explicitly stated that is not acceptable. In order for the system to be adequate, it needs to be based on analysis of the cost of educating different types of students, right? Without that analysis, you can't claim that it's adequate. And, there are people that will say, well, don't we elect, our state officials? And, we've got two of them that you'll hear from in a couple minutes, right? Who've both been former state legislators to make these kind of decisions. And the answer is yes, but when it comes to primary and secondary education, there's a higher bar. Right. And we need to, my functional definition of adequacy is an adequate funding formula is one which is based on the cost of serving students with different educational needs and adjusting funding to reflect uncontrollable cost differences across school districts for size, geography, transportation. You need to make sure that the funding is appropriate for the typical student, and it's appropriate for students with different needs, and it's appropriate for districts that themselves have different needs. And that's pretty easy to explain in concept. It's harder to do in practice, right? And so I'll talk in a minute about how we actually go about doing that and how the Fair School Funding Plan does it. What does equity mean? Okay, equity is essentially an equitable school funding formula adjusts for the disparities in local wealth and revenue raising capacity across Ohio's 609 school districts, right? The good news about having 600 school districts is that you've got a lot of local control. The bad news is that functionally, less wealthy school districts have less local control than wealthier school districts. If you don't have a lot of property to tax, there's only so far you can get regardless of how generous your residents are in terms of voting for school levies. And so offsetting disparities in the different across districts and how wealthy they are, that is the primary equity problem that Ohio and other states face. And the DeRolf decision, mentioned this as well, right? It talked about the over-reliance on local property taxes. And, more than 25 years later, I wish that they would have been a little bit more explicit about exactly what they meant. There's different ways you can interpret over-reliance. Some people think it means our property taxes are too high. Some people think it means we have too many school levies. If you actually read the DeRolf decisions, and there are 5 of them, and I've read them all multiple times. I'm embarrassed to say how many times I've read them. It's important reading. I wouldn't say that all of it is interesting reading, but if you read these decisions closely, it becomes very clear what the court meant about over-reliance on property taxes, because they cite example after example after example of a wealthy school district being able to do some things and less wealthy districts not being able to do those things. They clearly meant that the inequities in local property wealth are the issue that needs to be addressed, and that's part of what the Constitution says when you're going to have a thorough and efficient system of education. And so reliability is the last thing I talk about, because once you fix this, it needs to stay fixed, right? We can't just fix it once and leave it alone and then let it all unravel again. So those are the three things you need to do. And then, Susie, you want me to talk about the mechanics of how we get to adequacy and the simplistic way we can get to how we make the system more equitable? Sure. All right.
That was sure.
All right, Susie's nodding at me and giving me the green light. So, again, if you have questions about anything I've said so far, just type them into the chat and we can get to them later. How do you get to adequacy, right? And I think, the idea is that you need to have some cost-based methodology of doing this, right? And there are some people out there who, will suggest, and you might hear, that this is impossible, that there's no scientific method, that there's no perfect method for doing that. And I would say that that's not true, right? That there's three primary ways that you can get at this problem. One is you can find an economist, somebody like me, who can take the data that we have on the types of students we have, the characteristics of the school districts we have, the outcome measures we have on the districts, and you can amass all that data and you can do statistical analysis of it, and that will give you some cost numbers of what it takes to educate a kid in typical circumstances, and then what the additional amount of money is needed to educate kids that have additional educational needs. And, that's the kind of thing, when I went to graduate school and I learned how to do those things, and, I get out of my office at Ohio State and I come downtown and I've done a report for the governor and I start talking to legislators. And if what you do is you bring them an economic statistical analysis of this, it appears like it's a black box to them, right? You can spit out numbers and those numbers can be very accurate, okay? But if policymakers don't have an understanding of why one district is getting one amount and one district's getting another amount, and how if this changes, it will change the outcomes in this way, and if that changes, it will change it in another way, I learned relatively quickly that for policymakers, they need to understand the outcomes that you have if they're going to accept them, and they need to be able to explain them to one another, and that the citizens of Ohio need to explain them, right? So you can use statistical analysis to support your model, but I've learned that if that is the basis of your model, you're going to run into a lot of obstacles, and I think a lot of those obstacles are legitimate. If you can't articulate in regular English why your model gets the outcomes it gets and how it works, you're fighting an uphill battle. And to my knowledge, there's only one state that's tried to do this to approach it this way, and it was Texas. Okay, and I know the woman who ran their model, and it was very good, and it did not last. And so you're left with two other approaches. One is you can work backwards from identifying districts that do well and look at what they spend, or you can identify the components of a quality education and figure out what they cost. And that's what the Patterson work group did. Okay, and that their model is an inputs-based model, and I think that that is very easily explainable to people. It's intuitive, it's understandable. You can understand how, if you change your assumptions in one area, what it's going to do to the cost numbers that you're getting. It makes sense. You can have policy debates about what the right student-teacher ratios are and things like that. And I think that that is something which, for me, my bar that an adequacy formula has to clear is that it needs to be transparent, it needs to be understandable, and it needs to have the validity that it was developed by people that know what they're doing. And we can, the Patterson model clears every one of those bars. And so, to cut this short, because people who know me know I can talk all night, essentially you've got, John Patterson's laughing, but he's seen me do it, what you need to do is basically figure out what the base cost is, the cost of educating the typical student in the typical place, and then you need to figure out what the additional cost of educating students that have additional needs are. And for those, we have cost studies that we can do where you can look at kids who are learning English, we can look at kids with disabilities, we can look at students who are economically disadvantaged, gifted students, career tech. All of those things we can do cost studies on, and we can look at what their needs are and how much they cost. And we've had a couple of those cost studies done in the last couple of years, and hopefully that they'll be implemented, not this budget go around, but in 2 years. We'd like to have a study of economically disadvantaged students, but that's what it takes to get adequacy. And I get very frustrated when I hear people say, it's impossible, you can't do it, it's not scientific, because all these things are scientific. You don't need a computer for something to be scientific. And you need smart people, and you need people who understand what they're doing. And so, as far as equity, the key components of equity are that your formula needs to take into account not just the property wealth of school districts, but also the income level of their residents, because both those things are important. The property values tell you what your tax base is, and the income level of your residents tells you about their ability to tap into it. So if you have two communities with the same property wealth, but one of them has a lot of industrial property that's highly valued and their residents are poorer, and one of them has mostly residential with wealthier people, which one of those places is going to be better able to support their schools? It's the one with the wealthier people, because industrial properties can't vote and they don't have the revenue. So the formula that we have in the Patterson model takes both those things into account. And the key thing we need to do is to be using the most current possible data and to be updating that data regularly and in sync with each other. And if we can do all those things, we can put together what I think is a constitutional funding system that complies with the DeRolf decisions. And I think I'll stop here. So
Wonderful. I learned a lot, even though I've heard about this probably for 7 years. So thank you. You're a good teacher. So we have need, we have a remedy. Can we have a solution? So our next two long-term advocates for this project, we want to ask you what has been accomplished and what's left to do from your perspectives. So for John and Jim, please give us a short history of the process that you led to create the plan, and what do you see as its strengths? And please tell us what was achieved in the last biennial budget and what didn't make it.
Well, thanks, Susie. And Howard, I was laughing because I've known you so long. Every time I'm in your presence, I learn something new. And I've known Howard since I was first elected to the legislature, and my opinion of you continues to soar like that of an eagle, given all that you know. So I respect you, and it's good to see you again, my friend.
Thank you.
Susie,
You're very kind.
Well, you've earned it. So a little bit of the historical background. You heard that I am indeed a retired teacher. In fact, that's why I retired and ran for office, was to fix school funding. And I know that some people thought I was crazy, my wife included, that this is something that had been going on. I was in the classroom when the first DeRolf came about, and my superintendent, and we were negotiating at the time, and I was on the team. He said, "Oh, John, this is going to be good. DeRolf is going to fix this. So we'll be able to predict what we're going to have, and it will make negotiations better." That was in the early 90s. It hasn't happened yet. And keep in mind, when we're talking about school funding, we force each individual district to come up with a 5-year plan so that they have to project 5 years out. They can't count levies that have not been voted yet. And imagine yourself trying to figure out where you're going to be in 5 years. And here's the catch-all. The state operates on a 2-year budget. So the problem has been, you never know how much money you're going to get from the state. And I think right now you're going to hear some concerns that there's large carryovers in some of these districts. And I know the Senate president made those remarks the other day, but that's due. And Howard, you can tell me if I'm wrong on this. Part of it is the influx of federal money that was used to supplant parts of the plan. And I think another thing that is causing some concern for districts, they don't know if the Senate's going to come through with this. And if I'm a treasurer, I'm going to be responsible and have enough money on hand to carry myself through. So Jim will touch on those things a little bit more. Point of the matter is, it's very complicated. And I served on the primary secondary subcommittee of finance on education. And I can tell you, we did have about 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks to work on school funding. And there were a grand total of 5 of us on the committee. Howard has made his career studying school finance, and to expect people who are term limited and have some knowledge and deep concern to understand this and do what's right in every other year when we do a budget in such a short period of time. That just wasn't the way to do this. So former Representative Cupp and former then Speaker Cupp and I decided that we would recruit experts in the field, people who do this every day. And so there was this young whippersnapper who had just retired from his lobbying efforts, a guy by the name of Jim Betts. He's just a shade over 39, and you'll see him shortly. He helped us to recruit treasurers and superintendents from around the state for 8 different subcommittees. And we studied every one of those components that Howard outlined. And I want to walk you through some of them and then tell you exactly where we are and then hand it over to Jim. The critical element on the adequacy side is the base cost. So when we figured out the base cost, we looked at research on best practice for teacher-pupil ratios. So in the kindergarten, for example, research tells us it's 1 teacher to 20 students. There's another ratio for the elementary, another ratio for middle school, and in the high school, it was 1 to 27. So what you do is figure out as a superintendent, as a school board, where your student population falls. So I'm going to give you a concrete example how this Fair School Funding Plan meets the tailored need of each district. So Susie, you are now the superintendent of Cleveland Heights High School, fair enough? And Tanisha, you are the superintendent of, take your choice. Where would you like to be superintendent? Columbus City? Oh, perfect. Okay, we got you. So both of you might have the same number of students. Say that you're both pretending, we'll do this simply, that you're educating 1,000 students. But Susie, you might have a large clump of students, K-5, and Tanisha, you might have a large student in the high school. And every district is different. Depends where their student body is in terms of demographics. Now, on just that fact alone, if we know that it takes more teachers at the lower levels to teach our kids, who do you think is going to get more money just for teacher costs? Susie, I'm going to let you answer this one.
Who's going to get more?
Yep.
The elementary, people with
Exactly.
elementary. We let class size go up for high school.
That's right. That's how intuitive this is. So when we did base costs, we took the average teacher salary, we threw out the outliers, high and low, average costs around the state using data that's available, including their benefits. So we know exactly what it costs to hire a typical teacher in Ohio. And then we added on that the costs of running a building, the cost of having a principal, the cost of having school resource officers, the cost of having a librarian. Every component that is required for a typical student for his or her education is included in the base cost, and it can be justified. Then, in addition to the base cost, there are what we call categoricals, the things that you add on, transportation, and Howard alluded to this. English language learners cost a little bit more money because they're all over the board in terms of their abilities. Economically disadvantaged students, we know they cost more. And the students with disabilities and handicaps, again, costing more, but we have to study those costs as they change. So what we've done, in theory, was to put together a formula that would be adequate for all children throughout the state. That addresses the adequacy side. And Howard is right on the other side. When we look at capacity, and that's the term that we use, the ability for a district to raise revenue, that too is variable depending upon that particular district. No 2 districts are alike in Ohio, so how could we expect the state to fund each of them equally? It depends on their resources. It depends on property wealth. It depends on their income wealth. And if we know what the cost is, and we know what their capacity is, and you subtract, and I'm being real simplistic here, Howard. If you subtract the costs from if you have the costs and you subtract the capacity, then the state should fill in the blank. Am I right on that, Howard?
A equals B minus C. Yeah.
That's it. And it's all available. The problem is that we've been so far behind that the state has not, and 2 years ago, this was a 6-year phase, and we knew it was going to cost a lot of money, that in order to get to where we wanted to be, we'd have to phase it in over a period of time. This phase in must continue. And there's another component of this, and Tanisha, you hit on it as well. We used the 2018 costs to figure out the first few years, because that's what we had when this was being introduced and such, to figure out the average teacher salaries and the benefits and that. We are proposing to update those to the most recent year, which would be 2022, for which we have available. That way we can keep current with respect to inflation. And so all of that is a part of where we stand right now. And Jim, I'm going to pass it over to you to give a more fuller appreciation of what is going on in the legislature.
Well, thank you, John. And also thank you, Howard, because a couple of things that you mentioned certainly describe the Fair School Funding Plan. You may recall that Howard talked about one of the things that is required if people are going to understand a school funding mechanism is that it must be objective, it must address the needs of students, but it must also be transparent. And that is one of the things, I should say, those are a couple of things that Cupp and Patterson demanded of the members of the work group. They brought to this task expertise. John and Bob wanted to be sure that the Ohio School Funding Plan was one crafted by Ohio educators who had experience with dealing with and trying to develop Ohio's youth. And basically, this is, if you will, a tailor-made funding plan crafted by Ohio educators to meet the needs of Ohio's youth. Throughout, they, of course, relied upon their own expertise, but they held hearings, they invited experts, they enjoyed conversations with various educators and board members around the state before reaching any conclusions specifically about what they were going to recommend. Because there was one other dictum that Bob and John had laid down, and that was, don't come to us with a recommendation unless you can justify it. You can justify it by national research. You can justify it by best practices established within the education communities around the country, with successful programs and techniques in other states. And you always have an opportunity to exercise the judgment born out of your own experience dealing with and making sure that Ohio's youth under your jurisdiction are being properly trained and properly prepared for the future. So this was not a snatch and grab. This was something that, to the very detail, was essentially established through objective, transparent practices that are already in use and have been proven around the country. That narrative, justify, 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 became one of the bywords of all the members of the work group, because they knew that this was not a wish list that they were developing, but this was an objective assessment of what students need. Whether you start with the pupil-teacher ratios in kindergarten through 12, or the number of principals or assistant principals or other administrators needed in a building, the technology, how much did it cost to bring the internet into a building? How much does it cost to circulate that accessibility throughout that building? What kind of equipment should, for example, a child have if he's going to take advantage of that internet? So the base cost, for example, included a Chromebook or equivalent to be spent, basically, I should say, underwritten over a 4-year replacement cycle, so that there was a specific cost for each of those elements that allowed children to be able to use a computer to aid them in their studies. That was the kind of detail, I should say, that the work group went through in order to be able to provide what Howard basically had described, something that was objective, understandable, and very transparent. Already we have modified parts of the base cost because there have been changes in the way in which the General Assembly has decided that they would like to create that particular component. Did you want to ask a question, Susie?
Yeah, John had mentioned the phase in, and I'm not sure everybody understands what that was and what happened in the first 2 years. Could you just
Okay.
back up on that a little bit and explain that and where we
Absolutely.
are now?
Absolutely.
And also, what have you learned after 2 years of implementation that is shaping what you're advocating for now?
So let me do that. As was suggested by Susie and also by John, when we looked at the difference between where we were funding at the state level then established in 2018 and 19, and where the fair school funding would take us, and if in fact the General Assembly decided to fully fund that plan, that new plan, it would have required $2 billion, almost exactly $2 billion additional dollars. And bringing that to the General Assembly, we wanted everybody to be clear as to exactly what the size of the increment was going to be with regard to the responsibility they shared with the local voters in the state and local shares. And so that $2 billion became, of course, what was the bogey that was going to have to be met by the General Assembly and by the local voters in the state of Ohio. Too much for 1 year, too much for one biennium budget cycle. So it was decided that it should be spread out over 6 years. The first 2 years, of course, have already been in force. The budget was adopted in June of 2021 for fiscal years 22 and 23, beginning July 1st of 2021 and ending, of course, June 3rd of 2023. The governor basically endorsed the Fair School Funding Plan because in his budget proposal to apply to fiscal years 24 and 25, beginning this July 1st, he included the concept of the next steps, the phase-in years 3 and 4 in his budget proposal. One thing he did do, however, that had to be addressed was that he continued to use in his dollar projections the data from 2018. Now that would create a problem if it were to continue in that particular respect, because what has happened already from 2018 to the present is a major shift in the responsibility for funding school and education funding in the state of Ohio from the state to the local taxpayer. For example, in years 2018 and 2019, fiscal 2018 and 19, the state share was 50%. In 2022, which was completed, of course, last July 1st, the state share was 42.2%. In 2023, which will soon be completed at the end of this June 30th, the state share will be approximately 39.8%.
We're going backwards.
If in fact the 2018 data were continued to be used as was true in the governor's proposal, in 2024, the state share would be 37.4%. And in 2025, the state share would be 35.5%. Now that's an almost 15% shift from state to local voters if in fact the governor's proposal as it existed in House Bill 33 originally were to continue. The House has addressed that, and they have said basically that the most recent data we have from the Ohio Department of Education is for fiscal year 2022. And after some considerable debate, because it requires a lot of additional money, it was decided by the House that that data year that was in the governor's proposal should be changed to 2022 for both fiscal 24 and 25. A lot of additional monies will be required in that case. But because of that, the state share in 2024 would be 43.1 and in 25, 41.1. So one of the tasks when you have this kind of a shared responsibility is to make sure that there's a rational and hopefully reliable relationship between the state's requirements and the local voters, taxpayers' requirements. That will be certainly one of the aims of the Fair School Funding Plan throughout the duration, hopefully, of this Fair School Funding Plan. So one of the things that we have to be concerned about as the version adopted by the House for House Bill 33 that includes that 2022 data for years 24 and 25 is retained in the Senate version. Of course, the next step after that, and this would be in 2025, when the next budget cycle is being considered, is there must be insurance that years 5 and 6 of the phase-in of the values of the various provisions of the Fair School Funding Plan are fully phased in at the end of that 2-year cycle. Now, by that time, of course, inflation being what it is, will require another adjustment in the data year. By that time, data should be available from 2024. So the hope would be that the General Assembly would adopt the 2024 data for fiscal years 26 and 27. But that same kind of adjustment would be required in every year subsequent to that, because inflation is never ending and will require adjustments not only to maintain some reasonable relationship between the state and local share, but also to make sure that inflation doesn't eat into and erode the values that these educators have spent so much time in trying to very objectively and transparently create and provide the adequacy that Howard has talked about earlier. So that ongoing challenge is going to be something that is going to require the support of every parent, every school district, every responsible citizen in the state of Ohio to ensure that the quality can be retained as inflation takes its inevitable bite out of the cost of doing business. Okay. So thanks for that thought, because that becomes the real challenge facing us with regard to the Senate and its contemplation of what their version will be of House Bill 33. That particular issue itself caused a lot of debate in the House, quite some time when we weren't sure that they were going to come up with the right answer, but they did, thanks to the leadership, frankly, of a new speaker who has the unfortunate situation where you have a split Republican caucus, which is the majority caucus in the House, just as it is in the Senate. And it was not an easy task. They did it with the almost 100% support of the Democrat caucus in the House. And we'll probably continue to rely upon that to the balance of this budget process. But there's a couple other things that I would also like to mention.
Please.
And that is back to, again, what Howard really emphasized, and that is the fact that in order to be equitable, there has to be a logical relationship between the median, shall we say, capacity and those two districts that lie above it, but most particularly those school districts that are below that in capacity. For example, there is used in Ohio in order to provide fairness to those school districts who have a lesser capacity, a varied factor or multiplier that is used to determine against the individual district's base cost amount what the local share should be. And that local share obviously should be less for those school districts who have a lesser capacity. If, for example, the median district in the state had a capacity of $100,000, and there was a district in southeastern Ohio that had a capacity of $50,000, then the multiplier for that district in southeast Ohio should be half of what the multiplier is for that median district. And that's the concept that in large part was advocated by Howard throughout the process. There were several iterations that were made with regard to that distribution system to ensure that those school districts with the lesser capacity were being not only adequately provided for, but equitably provided for as well. And I think that's one of the real strengths of the Fair School Funding Plan, because the decision has been made, the plan provides for on a very equitable basis, and as Howard has also pointed out, a very transparent basis to determine whether or not the state of Ohio is being fair to those school districts who need its help the most. Okay.
So you've answered, one of my questions was, do we ever have a solution, or do we have to stay involved in this issue forever? Because you've got a constant change going on. So there really isn't a final answer. There might be a final method.
Yeah, there might be a final method. And at the same time, there could be changes in the way in which education requirements change, methodologies change, and therefore the base cost will change. Its elements might change. There may become such dependence upon technology that class sizes of 50 to 1 could ultimately be efficient. If so, then probably we're going to be investing more in technology than we are in pupil-teacher relationships. And so as a result, the basis for determining that base cost could change. There's got to be an ability to do that properly. And that's why, as Howard has also pointed out, the transparency is so important. You can go into any part of the base cost. And if circumstances change, you can basically modify the base cost to reflect those changed circumstances and reflect the either additional or lesser costs that might be required.
Yeah. So,
and Susie, let me interject something here and amplify what Jim just said. That's part of the beauty of this formula. If we need to adjust one component, transportation, base cost, you just pull that out of the formula and tweak it, as opposed to throwing everything out, which had been the case prior. So flexibility is an issue too. And Susie, here's one other thing. As a former classroom teacher, this formula is predictable. And I've been in touch with a number of superintendents in my travels, in my new role, to ask them about this. And their comment was, John, we didn't get any new money, but we would give that up for the predictability that we have. We know what kind of money we ought to be getting from the state. And that allows them to plan for programming that's sometimes cut if you don't have the funding for it. And I'm thinking about FFA or consumer science or mechanical drawing or some of those enrichment courses that were forced to be cut, or elementary art, music, and gym, when districts were forced to make difficult decisions because they didn't know what the future held for them. So the predictability is critically important.
If I may, just another thought, Susie, unless you heard enough from me.
You get a few more minutes.
Another part of this truly is the fact that the base cost on the old formula had lost its meaning. The transparency wasn't there. nobody knew exactly what the dollars stood for. And as a result, it was almost impossible to modify to make it more efficient,
Yeah.
more helpful. Not only that, but it created some of the strangest, shall we say, and inappropriate and certainly unequal results based upon that formula. For example, there were 3 school districts in 2018, not necessarily of identical size, but of almost identical valuation, property valuation, and income. Not identical, one might be a little bit higher in one than the other, but in these 3 school districts, here's the results that were occurring under the old formula. One of them received $8,100 per year, and this is in 2018 per pupil. Another one, $8,400 per pupil. A third one, $12,420 per pupil. Now, mind you, the incomes and the valuations per pupil
The same.
were almost identical. And here's the tragedy of that. The compensation that the taxpayers at the local level had to make because of the fact they weren't getting adequately supported by the state. In that one district that only received $8,100 per pupil had effective millage, voted tax millage of 52. The second one, receiving $8,400 per pupil, had voted tax millage of 37. The third one, with almost identical wealth capacity, had an effective tax millage of 22.
Yeah.
Now, that's one of the reasons why there was such concern in the minds of the educators who were working on this, and Bob Cupp and John Patterson, that we do this right, because they wanted to be truly fair to every student, to every district, and every taxpayer. Okay, and it wouldn't last very long if it wasn't fair to all 3 of those particular groupings. So there was a lot of sensitivity to some of these peripheral issues that are hopefully going to be to allow this to be a permanent plan that can last for decades and continue to be fair because of that transparency, that fixability, and that reliability.
Fixability. I like that.
Can I just add, Jim, I think, despite everything you just said, you were too nice to the old formula, because it's actually worse. I would describe it much more harshly, right? And there was a question in the chat about, how many years have we not had a constitutional funding formula, right? And, in, my Senate testimony from 2 years ago, which I think is on the OEPI website, I've got a little summary of the DeRolf law rulings, and then I've got a summary of school funding in Ohio going back to 1990. And from 1990 to 1998, the legislature was basically choosing the numbers in the formula. How much for the base cost, how much more for low-income kids, how much were we giving to students with disabilities. The DeRolf decision said that was not okay. We spent 13 years from 1999 through 2011 going through several different methodologies to try to objectively, get cost-based parameters in the formula. And, we learn as we go. We started with one thing, we change it, depending on how you count. There were 3 or 4 different methods we used, right? But, we were having the conversation, we were thinking about the issues, we were making the effort, and that all stopped in 2012. And from 2012 to 2021, we stopped trying to use cost-based methodologies. And by 2021, there was not a single number in that formula that was based on the cost of educating a kid, right? That was, we had special ed weights that were more than 10 years out of date, and none of the other numbers were based on any methodologies at all. And so, I think we had a period where, we made a good faith effort for 13 years, and then we reverted to just kind of shrugging our shoulders saying, this is hard, we're not going to do it, right? It's not solvable. And John Patterson and Bob Cupp said that's not okay. And so, we've gotten ourselves back on track, and, we'll always be tweaking this. It's always going to change, and that's fine, right? I mean, and Jim and John, I'm sure you remember this as vividly as I do. There was a meeting of the school funding task force the day after the Parkland shooting in Florida.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It was February 15th. I remember that meeting. And that meeting, a lot of the discussion was about what do we need to do, what do we need to be doing in our schools to help to support kids, to keep them safe, to manage their emotional, and mental well-being and things like that. There were things that were put into the formula that were not in the formula before that meeting and before that happened. And that's a vivid example of it, but there's going to be other examples, and hopefully they won't be as tragic, right? But this will evolve, and that's okay. But you need the framework in place to allow those discussions to happen.
May I also add, and Howard, you're absolutely right, and we appreciate that appreciation of what the tasks that John and Bob outlined and how those educators followed it. And what's important to realize too is that not every school gets more money in the Fair School Funding Plan. And the fact that they don't get more money is fair. And this is perhaps hard to understand, but for years under the old formula, there were school districts that were on the guarantee, i.e., that meant that because they had received more money from the state the year or the years before, they were getting money that they didn't deserve under the formula. And at the same time, there were people, for example, one very rapidly growing district in Central Ohio, who 1 year, because of the fact that the General Assembly decided in their residual funding that they would cap the amount of additional money that any school could get in any 1 year. And that school district for at least 2 years received $40 million fewer than the existing formula said they should be receiving. And John and Bob said, we're going to eliminate those caps, and to the extent possible, and still be fair to districts, we're going to eliminate guarantees. We still have some work to do in that latter area, but all the caps will be gone by the time that the full funding, the full implementation of the Fair School Funding Plan has occurred at the end of fiscal 2027.
So in the interest of time, I think we need to move on a little bit. I think you've convinced us there's a need and there's actually a workable remedy. And there's been some progress, and there's new understanding of more progress that's needed. So can you help each of us, each of you, would you take a turn at telling us what you think we should do to affect the outcome? We've got to get this thing to become continuing law. Where should we focus our efforts? Does our interest matter? Is there a message that you think is especially powerful? What should we be asking for? So who would like to go first?
I can
Go for it, Tanisha. You haven't had a chance for a while.
Yes.
I know you feel strongly about this.
Right. So at Policy Matters, we're a part of the Lynn for Ohio Kids campaign. And underneath that campaign, when it comes to school funding and education and what we would like to see is a lot of what, just to echo back to what Howard and John and Jim were talking about in terms of updating that base cost, to make sure that we are adequately providing for what students need in schools. When you look at the House sub bill, right, you see that the updated cost will result in about a 12.1% increase in per pupil spending. We see teacher salaries rising, right, from $30,000 to $40,000, but a part of our campaign is that we would like to see that to go up to at least $50,000 so that we can really provide meaningful and sustainable living wages for educators in our state. And then we want to continue to fight against, right, like the potential harmful legislation that is House Bill 11 and Senate Bill 11, because both of them will result in, close to $1 billion loss in revenue to public schools. So we want to, Governor DeWine in his state of state, he said that Ohio, he wants to make Ohio the best state, right, possible for just all things, for family, for people. And we know that education is a major part of that. But what, like, as I said earlier, you know, we're 46 in the nation, right, as we stand right now. And so it's like, if we really, really want to make Ohio the best state to educate our kids and for education, we need to make sure, you know, that every kid in every district and every school, right, has what they need and deserve to thrive. And so that's a lot of our advocacy. I wrote a funding paper that laid out a lot of the things we just talked about, everyone talked about in this call, and advocacy ways to get involved and different things like that, that we will share out, you know, after the call. But those are kind of our big things to do.
Howard, do you want to?
Sure, I will jump in. I will say the best thing you can do is don't let anybody convince you that this is too expensive for this state, because it's not. Okay, first of all, this is an investment more than it is an expenditure. Okay, our Constitution requires it, but common sense requires it even more strongly, that we need to invest in the human capital in this state. And that, you know, the Senate has been, you know, exaggerating, inflating, and bloviating about the cost of this model since it was first released. And at one point they tried to, they put out a completely indecipherable memo, which purported to say that this actually cost $4 billion a year, which it does not. They're going kicking and screaming to update the inputs, which is an absolute requirement, so that you can plausibly claim that this is adequate. And you know, they're acting as if updating these inputs over time is some revolutionary concept that we've never seen before, whereas it's basically standard operating procedure. And at the same time, they're prepared to push forward a universal voucher program, which would cost over $1 million before one single kid moves from a public school to a private school. That's what it would cost to basically provide handouts for people who have children already in private schools or are homeschooled. And that's for 150,000 kids. And they're going to claim that, you know, the cost of updating the inputs in last year and this year would have been $60 million last year to make the inputs current, and $208 million this year. That's for 1.5 million kids. Okay, but they raised the voucher cost almost $100 million in 1 year, and they perfectly prepared to raise it 10 times beyond that. You know, and don't even get me started about, you know, the overflow of general fund revenue tax dollars that this state has had. It's been over $2 billion beyond estimate, you know, the last 2 years, right? And so they raised the estimates $1.6 billion for this year, and we're $800 million over that new estimate. And so the state absolutely has the money to fund this. And what they need is the political will to do it. And, you know, I've been doing this maybe too many years because I'm running out of patience for this. But the House has exhibited very clearly that they have the political will to do this, and we'll know in the next 2 weeks where the Senate stands on this, right? But this state has never been in a better position than they are right now to solve this problem. And they can do it now, and they can do it in the long run. And there's probably enough money that they can put every cent that we need into the school funding formula and still expand their voucher programs, right? But they're creating, you know, they'd like you to think that it's a false choice between one or the other, and it's not. So that's me on my soapbox. But that's, you know, so just think about, look at the facts. That's what I would say. And don't take no for an answer.
That's great. Jim, do you want to go next?
No, I defer to the Reverend Patterson because I'd like to hear what he has to say before I follow him. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Well, Susie, 2 years ago, you were part of a coalition that put direct pressure on the House and members of the Senate. And I would suggest reviving and solidifying that coalition and target all senators, because it's coming down to those 33, quite frankly. And one in particular has more influence over the other 32 than any of the others. Here's why this is important. We are excited about Intel coming in. We're excited about Honda coming in. But if we don't have workers to fill those positions, where are they going to come from? How is Ohio going to be sustainable? I know in my old house district that by 2030, a third of the population is going to be 60 and over. We are aging rapidly in Ohio. These young kids are our future. And this is an investment in Ohio's future. They have the money. They ought to have the will. They talk about tax cuts when they ought to be talking about doing what's right for our kids and our future. It's time to end the talk, enforce the action, make the right decision, push the right button when you come to the floor for a vote, do the right thing for Ohio. There, Jim, that was enough for me.
Thank you, John, and Howard and Tanisha as well. There's a couple of practical things that I would like to raise right now. I think as far as the Fair School Funding Plan is concerned, the House version would basically sustain the phase-in, would sustain the integrity of the values that are built into the Fair School Funding Plan, and sustain a reasonable relationship between the state and local share. That goes away if, in fact, the Senate does not concur in the change of the data year from 2018 to 2022. There's no way that the education community or the League of Women Voters or taxpayers are going to be able to intimidate the Senate into making a different decision than they're about to make. But if in fact that particular version coming out of the Senate does not include that data update, I think there will be a brief window when the failure of the Senate to adopt the House's version as far as data is concerned can be utilized in public media type of presentations that would basically demonstrate how their plan would basically put a much larger burden percentage-wise on the taxpayer at home.
Yeah.
A larger percentage of a much larger figure. That is a huge change and transfer of responsibility. Now, I'm saying if it's necessary, that might be something for the League and others to consider. I think the time to make that decision is after we see what's going to be in the Senate plan, right?
That the transfer of responsibility is a very strong argument, and you're making that clear, and I'm not sure that was completely clear to us. I think that's extremely important.
All right.
And local taxpayers are running out of steam. So I can see the whole funding of schools collapsing if we keep putting more burden locally. It just isn't fair, and it won't work.
Inflation being what it has been for the last few years, and the uncertainty in the future is going to make passing levies much more difficult. If in fact the trend for basically decreased state share and increased local share that would demand those levies make them in trouble. And as a result, I think that's something that we have to focus on, and maybe we ought to have another conversation after we see the Senate version.
Yeah, excellent. This is all very helpful.
Yeah,
so
we vote more on local levies than any other state, and it's not even close. So that's why we need there's more pressure on the state funding formula in Ohio than there is in a lot of other states, and that's partly because of the way our property tax works.
Yeah,
that's really helpful.
There's been a couple of different questions that have touched on that, and maybe you can work your comments around this. What would be a good shared burden? Would you ever see a time when everything moves to the state paying for public education in Ohio? Basically what is causing this decrease in the state share?
I just want to add, in 1935, the state share was 68%. Go for it, you guys that know the answers.
Well, the easiest answer in that question was the fact that unless the Constitution is changed, there will always be a local share. That's just the way it's written. It is indeed a shared responsibility. And the next easiest question would say that because of inflation, it has cost more to educate students, and unless we change the inputs and update them to 2022, it will continue to erode and create additional discrepancies between what the state ought to pay and what the locals will pay. And Jim, I want to thank you for always being the rational one in our dichotomy here, because sometimes I just get too passionate about education, having been in the classroom for 3 decades.
I think also we perhaps ought to feel grateful to the Constitution that it does require a partnership as far as funding education
agree.
is concerned. Because in fact, if the state were to assume that responsibility, the state would feel they had every right to make every decision affecting education that could possibly be required. And local boards of education who try to interpret the needs of the local community would have no role to play. And I don't think we ever want to do that. But I think we do need to oversee what's going on and make sure that that relationship remains appropriate and not too one-sided, with the burden being on the locals. Okay, we are a local control state, and I think that is good. And I think most every educator who is active here in the state of Ohio is happy about that. But at the same time, that probably just wouldn't exist if in fact there wasn't a role financially for the local community and district to play.
I'd just add very quickly that from a practical standpoint, it makes sense the way we've divided our tax burden in this state, because local governments don't have the ability to withstand large fluctuations in revenue. And historically, property taxes are the most stable source of revenue that we have. And that's why we use them at the local level. So yeah, I wouldn't envision, for the local control reasons that Jim and John both mentioned, plus the practical stability of the property tax, I think it makes sense to have a local share. And then it's just up to the state to make sure that they distribute state aid in a way that, you know, creates equity across wealthy and poor places.
Another question, Karen?
Basically that's all, there's this running commentary going on, and most of us that have been in education know that, and there were a couple of comments about people who came in to testify that throwing more money at education is not going to solve the problems, basically. And a lot of that has to do with people don't understand the differences in districts and the experiments and ways that if we don't support the whole child, if we, the fact that economically disadvantaged children are at, and maybe Tanisha, you can say something about this from the whole Policy Matters Ohio concept of the healthy child. I know from teaching in poor districts, if I didn't worry about kids having the basics, that even in that involved food, that involved so many different things they couldn't learn, that there are differences in this formula for economically disadvantaged, because there are school districts that are now providing wraparound services in order to create learning environments. So basically, the big question is, how do we deal with lawmakers who are listening to these quote unquote experts coming in, who are paid handsomely to come in and testify that their research shows throwing money at education doesn't help?
I know Eric Hanyashek, and he is actually like myself from
Name the name.
suburban Cleveland. I have spoken to him many times on this. His article, which was literally called Throwing Money at Schools, I read it in about 1986, I think, when I was in graduate school. It's one of the things that got me to study all of this stuff. And if you read carefully what he says, he's very misunderstood, because what he really says is that it matters how you spend it. Right? That's one of his key takeaways. Somehow that never seems to come out when he talks about it. It never is interpreted that way. And there's a lot of apples and oranges comparisons, right? And, you know, it's very easy to say, oh, look, this place spends a lot and they do terribly on their standardized tests. This place spends a little and they do very well. Those districts are completely different. Their students have completely different needs, right? You know, there's a data element on the Ohio Department of Education website, which is the expenditure per equivalent student, which adjusts for the cost differences between students, and it does give you an apples to apples comparison. Lately, the comparison that a lot of people have been making is to say, oh, well, our voucher amount is $7,500, but look, this school district gets $12,000 and they do terrible. Again, it's an apples to apples comparison because, you know, in your opening remarks, Susie, you said that school districts have to serve every kid who walks through their door, where private schools get to pick their students. And they tend not to pick students with disabilities, and not to pick students who need to learn English, and not to pick students who cost other. We finally got some data about this from ODE a couple years ago, and it showed that the average additional cost for a school district in Ohio is 28%. The average district additional cost for a private school in Ohio is 7%, right? That their students are less expensive to educate than public school students are. So a lot of those comparisons, and you know, for whoever wrote that question, I 100% sympathize with you, because that drives me crazy. It's one of my trigger points, right? Hearing that. It's a very easy soundbite to make, and it takes me 10 minutes to rebut it, and by then nobody's listening anymore. And but there are, you know, it is a false comparison, right? And so but Tanisha, I will turn it over to you to talk more about, you know, the differences in those costs and why we need an economically disadvantaged cost study. So
Oh, I mean, I think for the most part, you covered it. A lot of what I know, I got from reading your report. But, you know, what we know is that, you know, the plan is supposed to increase the spending, right, for equitable distribution of, you know, schools with higher concentrations of Black and brown students, economically disadvantaged students should be receiving, you know, slightly more increases compared to schools with smaller populations of those students. And so I think that, you know, Howard, like you said in your report, that there's a need for the study, for a cost study analysis for, you know, what it costs to truly educate a child that experiences poverty, right? A child that is food insecure, is housing insecure. We need to know like what it costs so that we can provide what they truly need in schools. And then it's like also just on the whole, right? We need more funding for mental health services and supports, counselors, psychologists, right? Like all of these things that create these positive school environments to really make our schools safer, because, you know, school safety is a huge issue right now in light of all these school shootings and different things. School violence has been on the rise in Ohio. You look at different districts. So it's like, how are we funding to make sure that our schools, you know, what are we doing to make sure our schools are safer, that all students, regardless of where they live, what they look like, where they come, right? Like how they identify, like that they are protected and safe and they have what they need.
Any other comments? We have a few questions and we can move into that regarding basically what can people do at this point? And Susie, should we move into those slides?
Yeah, we're just about done, so yeah.
Yeah, let's put up the slides. What can you do? And, you know, and thank you for bringing up the focused work we did a few years ago. Nazik, you can move to the next slide. As everyone's been saying, first of all, the most basic message out of all of this is we've got to support our public schools. That's a democracy issue, and we've got to use the current data and fully fund the Fair School Plan in the operations budget. This is absolutely essential to Ohio. That's the basic message. How you deal with that message has to be from where you are in this state and who your senator is. So let's move to the next slide. Our first target is the Senate Finance Committee. And there they are. There are their emails. But more important, if you're in one of their districts, plan a meeting with them. Call the office and let them know what you're thinking in terms of this. And, you know, something we keep saying over and over and over again, talk about your experience, talk about your schools, talk about your county. You know, Tanisha brought up the one of the obstacles is this movement to the universal vouchers. And how it pulls money. You know, why is the share going down? Because it's a bucket of money that has to be spread across all of these different pieces and line items. You need to talk about the importance of public schools in your area, and you have to know, is there, you know, what are those schools, and where are there even choices, basically. But we're starting with the Senate Finance Committee, and that's extremely important because that's where the budget is right now. Then make sure you talk to your own senator. It's really important that you give them that message that our public schools are essential to the economic development and the continued success of this state. Yes, we can do postcard campaigns. If you're if you're part of a local league or you're part of another group, don't be afraid to do a postcard campaign. A number of Northeast Ohio leagues have done that with great success. Target, especially if you are looking at someone who, especially, you know, yes, we've been talking around the issue. There is one person that basically controls the Senate, and the majority party falls in line, which means the Democrats get it in terms of the Fair School Funding Plan. And I'm not being partisan about it. I'm just looking at the facts of those I have talked to. Where we need to do more work is on the other side, so that all our senators understand the importance of our public schools, and you know how important they are to us. So that's the first thing. Do the letters to the editor. You know, I know how important letters to the editor are when I'm seeing senators and representatives in the General Assembly putting in letters to the editor. There's an awful lot of people who get their information from the letters to the editor. Don't be afraid of doing op-eds. Susie's been doing some really great op-eds. She has another one ready to go about this, but we need more people doing that. And it's really, really important to get that information out there. And don't be afraid to have some meetings, public meetings. You know, some of our leagues have gotten together with school treasurers and school superintendents to educate their communities about the issue and the importance of this in the budget. So please, make the most important thing right now are the phone calls. You know, it's a scale that they look at. The more effort you put in making your voice heard, the more likely they are to listen to you. So that phone call is more important than the email. If you're going to send an email, compose it yourself. Don't use a standard one. And if possible, send in at least a written testimony too, and copy everyone in. I'm getting to that point in doing that. What we need is a concerted effort all around in any way we can. And I want to at this point thank Susie for putting this forum together. She did a tremendous job. And I want to thank all of you for participating in this. And together we can keep fighting this. And we have to, for the sake of our children.
Good.
Susie, any final words?
No, this is about school funding, but it's also about saving an essential public institution and standing up for it and not allowing this drip, drip, drip of saying that it's useless. Really, this is a core institution in our democracy, and that's what we're fighting for here. And I know the process goes on and it can be confusing, but we just have to just hammer away, keep standing up for it. That's all I know what to do. So I really feel like I learned something tonight. I appreciate everybody who came on the call. I hope you learned something. And I'm really grateful to our panelists for all the work you're doing to protect democracy and to advance a stronger state, something that we can be proud of and a place you actually would want to stay. So thanks, everybody. And, we're open to suggestion anytime you, those of you who walk the halls of the State House and have a sense of things, send us your suggestions about where we need to put our pressure. So thanks a lot.
Thank you for the opportunity.